everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for our webinar today. I am Jingsong Zhao, and I am with Hyperproof, and I'm your host today. We'll jump right in, but before we do, a couple of housekeeping items. First of all, this presentation is being recorded, and everyone will be receiving the recording and the slides shortly after the live webinar. Second, we want to make sure to give you time to ask questions. So there is a live Q&A portion at the end. So as questions come up during the presentation, please just put them into the question box. With that, I'd like to tell you a little bit about the agenda for the webinar and introduce our two speakers today. So on this webinar, our speakers will be addressing the key security risks associated with remote work and BYOD environments, new security gaps organizations may now have, and how your organization can be continuously secured and compliant in the new environment without having to do more work. With that, I'd like to introduce to you our two speakers today. First, we have Francis Dewing, seasoned tech and security industry executive. Francis Dewing is the CEO of Rubica, a high-growth venture-backed company bringing advanced cybersecurity protection to mobile devices and remote working professionals. Rubica offers the only market solution powerful enough to provide enterprise-grade cybersecurity and privacy at a personal level to reduce the threat of cybercrime. Francis also regularly consults with boards, Fortune 500 executives, and private client groups on cybersecurity issues and best practices. Really glad to have you here. Hi, Francis.
Hi, thank you.
Our second speaker today is Craig Unger. Craig is the founder and CEO of Hyperproof, an innovative continuous compliance software company based in Bellevue, Washington. Prior to founding Hyperproof, Craig founded Azuqua and was a leader at Microsoft, where he led the development of Microsoft Dynamics, Access, and Excel. Craig has 26 years of experience building software used around the world. He loves technology and is addicted to designing software that delights and disrupts. Welcome, Craig.
Thanks, JC. Really happy to be here.
With that, I'll turn it to Francis to kick things off.
Thank you so much. Thanks for those intros. We will just jump right in here. And like JC mentioned, what we're talking about is really the effect that this mass shift to remote work has had on security. That's changed our lives and our norms in many ways. But from a cybersecurity perspective, there's two major consequences of remote work and COVID-19. One being that cyber criminals know that we're all working remotely using our insecure home networks, no IT support on site, very little security controls compared to the office, and they're specifically targeting remote workers for this reason. We recently, actually just in the last couple of days, AT&T released a study saying that 70% of large businesses believe that remote working is one of their most vulnerable points for cyber attack. And so we'll get into details of where those differences and vulnerabilities lie in terms of the new threat vectors presented by remote work and how you can address those in your compliance work. Secondly, though, just in terms of general trends, cyber criminals are opportunistic, and they're always looking at what's going on in the world, global trends that they can capitalize on to create enticing phishing and social engineering attacks. And that's exactly what they're doing with COVID right now, taking advantage of our fear and the chaos and our kind of insatiable need for information around things related to the virus, related to stimulus checks and loans, and even secondary trends like the uptick in use of video conferencing tools, Amazon deliveries, et cetera. All of these different trends they use to create specific phishing and malware campaigns. And we've seen just since COVID, there's been a 6,000% increase in phishing attacks. So these are kind of two trends that that where remote working has really changed our security environment. And one of the things that is has really been augmented is this lack of distinction between personal and work. Everyone now is a remote mobile worker, and this was something that was trending even pre-COVID, but that's accelerated greatly. And now it's really a fallacy to think that we can separate our personal and work worlds. We're all, one person wearing multiple hats at any given time, doing work, but in our personal life, oftentimes using the same device for work and personal. And again, this blending of personal and work activities creates exponential threat vectors and opportunities for attack. But the traditional kind of approach to security in that the attempt to try and segment work from personal to reduce those attack vectors is really just not practical now with remote work. So ultimately, even if your business was compliant at the start of the year, you may be out of compliance now with all your staff working from home. The reality is that a lot of the layers of security and the controls that we've put in place are office-based and corporate network-based. And now that everyone is remote, many of those are not applicable, and there's new and different threats that need to be addressed in a different way.
Fran, thanks for taking us through that in terms of the environment and some of the massive changes that really organizations all over the world are undergoing. The relationship between security and compliance is, they're very related. They're two sides of the same coin, but oftentimes the expertise is very different in the organization in terms of, who's driving some of these security pieces and how does it really kind of tie back, and how do you really know that you're compliant with the good work that an organization is trying to do to protect everyone. So what I started here for folks is a little bit of a cookbook to answer the question, how do I get back into compliance? I mean, we can almost wax a little bit philosophical on is compliance a point in time? Is it, an end state? What really is it? And it really is something that needs to be thought of as a continuous state that you're in. And so you can think of it almost as like a homeostasis, and there's like a source of a force that gets exerted on the system. In this case, it's remote work. People, acting all differently, using different tools. How do you get back into compliance? Well, let's go through it. First, it's around choosing a framework. And for some of those listening, you may already have a framework in place that you're using to baseline. The frameworks are valuable because they give you a coordinated set of requirements that help educate you and your larger organization as to what's required in order to remain compliant. They also act as a source of proof for any auditors or third parties, or increasingly supply chain vendors, partners who want to assure that in order to do business with you that you're compliant. For the sake of the examples in this presentation, I've chosen the SOC 2 certification, which is published by the American Institute of CPAs, the AICPA. And just as a flyby, it breaks down the compliance requirements into 5 what they call trust principles, which you can see on the right. Security, which is about protecting your data. Privacy, which makes sure that your own private data, especially a certain class of private data, is protected from prying eyes. Also in privacy, increasingly these days, it's also more around control of that data. Confidentiality, which is around really how the organization deals with its data destruction, other pieces like that. Processing integrity, mostly useful for financial institutions, perhaps manufacturing institutions. Most high-tech companies don't actually wade too far into processing integrity. And then finally, availability, which is kind of self-explanatory. Through the course of the presentation, I'll take you through some of the requirements that are in use for some of the topics that we're going to be talking about. But at the high level, I think what really folks need to understand is that the basic structure of all of these frameworks is the same. You pick a framework, you have a set of requirements, you pick a set of what they call controls, which is really a fancy word for the processes that you need to run in your organization, whether it's something like making sure you have a card key reader or processes to onboard and offboard folks into your company, and you define those as controls. And the combination of requirements, that are published by a standards body and your own published controls, which you evidence that are working, is the way that you can actually demonstrate compliance. And perhaps the last thing I'll say about it is that when you're actually practically going through the exercise, it feels very much for any of us who have done software development, like a software development exercise, because the process you go through, especially when you're figuring out what controls do I need for my company. First, a design process, how are we going to actually make sure, for instance, that our passwords are constructed properly? That's usually pretty straightforward. I want it to be 8 characters. I want to have a upper or lower, a special character. The next part is the implementation part, which is tougher. On the implementation side, you have to go and iterate through all these systems that we're talking about, including many that are now being used remotely, to make sure that that policy is taken into account. And then finally test it once in order to take it live, but then depending upon the appetite inside the organization, testing it more frequently, perhaps on a schedule. And if you use that basic cookbook approach, that's really how you'll be able to accommodate any new forces on the system and keep yourself in a continuous compliance state. So, I think with that, maybe I'll hand back to you, Fran. I know you're going to take everybody through the 3 zones of security. We could talk a little bit more about compliance as it relates to each zone.
Yeah, and I wanted to kind of pull on a point that you made in that, when you said that compliance is really an ongoing process, and that's the same with security. I think there's a tendency to think of what's the thing I can just install and then forget about when it comes to security, but that's, security and security threats are always adapting. And so security and compliance both need to be this continuous commitment, basically. And when we think of security, and when we think about having more than just check the box compliance, but having true security, you really need to think of kind of 3 zones of things that need to always be secure. If any one of them is neglected, then your whole system is potentially exposed. And the way I conceptualize that is these 3 zones of your devices, your connection to the internet, which, can be your network layer. It could be, your actual Wi-Fi or cell connection, but also the network layer, and the online accounts that you use. And so what we'll go through here is highlighting some of the challenges that remote working has presented in terms of security challenges for each of these 3 areas that are new things that we need to address. Starting first with devices. So this, with remote working, we're all using mixed use devices now. There's BYOD devices, regardless of whether your company has issued you a brand new corporate lockdown laptop. The reality is that most people are using at least one device, usually the phone, sometimes both phone and laptop, for both work and personal. And that blend of activities presents issues not just in the additional personal use and activities, bringing in a different threat vectors and cross-infection potential, but also this tension between what's reasonable in terms of how locked down or open those devices should be. This kind of this balance or tension between personal privacy and freedom, given that you're working from your home, you're potentially using a personal device for work, but also the fact that you are accessing work files from that network and from those devices. So what is that appropriate balance? And then also the first thing I'll touch on here is actually some of the inherent risks with mobile devices, both laptops and phones, that often go unaddressed, yet are now one of the largest emerging threat vectors for companies. So looking at mobile devices, again, this is pre-COVID even, Verizon releases a very extensive data breach report every year. And in 2019, they found that over 40% of breaches started with a mobile device. And now we know actually that the recent Twitter hack also started with a mobile device. So there's been just in the last handful of years, an amazing increase in mobile threats. Unfortunately, I think there's still this misconception that iPhones can't be hacked or that phones somehow are different than computers. And, in fact, they're just mini computers, right? They're an extension of us. We do everything from our phones that we can do from our computers now. And most often people actually are working more from their phones than their computers. Yet often mobile devices have very little protection as compared to computers.
Well, I'd also add there on the mobile device point that they're locked down. Those environments are fairly locked down. So it's very difficult. I'd say Android's a little bit more open than on the iOS side of things, but it's very difficult to deploy the same kind of security and protection strategies on these mobile phones. And so you have this really tough situation where they're being used more and more for access to corporate resources, but they're just harder and harder to really lock down.
That's right. I mean, and one example of that is antivirus, right? And I've got my strong opinions on antivirus, but you can't there is no antivirus for iPhone. There sort of is for Android, but even when you have antivirus deployed, which is often this kind of default control that people use, frankly, antivirus doesn't work anymore against modern malware. Most malware now is polymorphic, and it can evade in real time rule-based and signature-based detection methodologies, which is like host-based detection, like antivirus is just the majority of threats are not going to be caught by that. It doesn't mean that doesn't hurt to have it, but it's not going to. That should not be your silver bullet for device level protection. Yet oftentimes it is. And what we see, again, specifically on mobile devices is that while the computers may have some advanced threat detection and prevention, mobile phones often only have MDM or some sort of email-based, phishing filtering. And the problem with that is, on the email-based filtering specifically, is that most phishing, when it comes to mobile phishing, does not even come through email. It comes through SMS or social media or other apps. And so those email layers are not going to help with that. Similarly, MDM, that's great. It can let you remotely wipe the device. It can give you some controls around restricting app downloads and things like that. But it's, all of these on this slide here, all these threat vectors on the right-hand side are not protected by MDM. And so, there's this, unfortunate situation we're in where mobile devices are the fastest growing threat vector, yet they have little to no security compared to other platforms.
Well, and yeah, it really resonates what you're saying, Fran. And I'd also add, and I'm going to address this as kind of the operator of a business, not just somebody who happens to work in the compliance space. But if you look back, I used to work at Microsoft, and if you look back to when I got started there, all of our servers were behind the firewall, and they were all kind of hosted and managed by us. And then all the client devices were also managed by us. In fact, I don't want to date myself too much, but when I first got there, even carrying laptops wasn't, forget mobile devices, carrying laptops wasn't actually even the norm over there. But of course, then you have laptops, and that was kind of a shock to the system. You have mobile devices, but the other thing that's on the server side is we went from server to service. So the average organization now has a large enterprise has more than 1,200 cloud services that are deployed as part of their infrastructure. And so there's just been this kind of cacophony, if you want to use that word, of both devices, which for the purposes of this discussion, we're pretty much thinking about the devices on the client side, but you also have to think about what's going on the server side. I know we'll get there. And I think when you bring it back to compliance, so again, I'm pulling something here out of this is a specific recommendation, a set of requirements, again, out of the SOC program that I'm pulling. This is called the Common Criteria 6.8, Malicious Software on Devices. And before I get into any specific recommendations about it, I know it's an eye chart. You're not meant to read it all. It's here for you later if you guys want to check it out, when we for download. But I think the key is that whatever the requirements are, which in this case tends to be a lot about locking down these devices, making sure you do virus checking, change management in general as a vector for attacks against these devices. The reality is that there's just so many more that you have to deal with. And as we're talking about across so many platforms, and frankly, just to be really candid, some of them are easier to secure than others. I mean, I find it, again, as an operator of a business, I find it easier to secure down Windows clients. And then, after that are kind of the Mac and the Linux clients are next, and then mobile devices are just, unto themselves. So the point I'm trying to make is that when you're looking at these requirements, you're looking at the controls over here on the right-hand side of this chart, you'll see some suggested controls for how to deal with these. You're really dealing with like many, many instances, many different work items across many systems. Just to kind of like punctuate the point, we talked a little bit about the requirements around lockdown, around software, software and around change control. If you look on the right side, I've highlighted a couple controls that companies commonly put in place to be able to deal with the requirements and assure that devices are locked down. So change management policy, it's kind of an interesting thing. You'll hear talked about a lot in the compliance space. Before you get to the actual implementation of a solution, you're looking at the design, as I talked about before, right? And the design here is what policy have you put in place? And then you get to the tools. And specifically in this area, for this particular control, the two that I want to highlight are antivirus, which is well known. As we've been everybody's been implementing those for a really, really long time. There's a great set of them. But the other one is around configuration management and locking down the ability to install malicious software. And, just by way of observation, you kind of hope that those two things worked hand in hand. But in practice, there's actually not great solutions for both doing, antivirus and lockdown across multiple sets of devices. So it does turn out that you end up with a little bit of a soup of different tools, but those are the two that I would recommend that you look at most closely in terms of devices is antivirus and then also locking down and doing effectively your configuration management lockdown. So I'll give it back to you, Fran, for the second of your threat vectors that you're going through.
Yeah. So, in addition to devices, another one of the zones you really need to have locked down, and I would argue this is one of the most important layers, is the network. And the reason why, network layer threat detection and prevention is one of the most effective ways to detect and block threats. Even the polymorphic malware and new emerging threats that I was referring to that can evade antivirus, you can see those call outs. You can see in the traffic data egress and ingress, bidirectional data flows is one of the best ways to be able to detect anomalies and indicators of compromise. And the problem that we're facing now with remote working is that we're all using our basic ISP router, which maybe has some configuration settings that you can use to, change some of those defaults, but it lacks the firewall and intrusion detection, advanced threat blocking layers and tools that we've all kind of put in our office infrastructure. And so the default for many IT teams has become to roll out corporate VPNs to bring all those remote workers back into the office to get the benefit of those more advanced threat detection and prevention layers. And the problem with that is that corporate VPNs have actually been used as a threat vector now. So the FBI released a very detailed report, which was picked up by the New York Times just a number of weeks ago, about Russian crime organizations that were specifically targeting employees using corporate VPNs. So what they know is that we're all at home using these corporate VPNs to access our work files and systems, but they also know that people don't stay connected to the corporate VPN 100% of the day. Employees toggle it off and continue to email or web browse or use that device on the open internet. And that's when they become infected. And what the cybercrime group was doing was that, they're infecting the device, compromising the device, and lying dormant until the employee toggles back on the VPN and goes back into the office infrastructure. And they're using it to piggyback through that tunnel into the office, into the corporate network and propagate malware and ransomware. And so this is, there's been a huge uptick in this. And so now, I have no problems with VPN as tech. It's actually, Rubica, we use that as part of our tech stack to make sure that you can access the internet securely from anywhere, no matter what network you're using. But it's how it's deployed in conjunction with human nature that has become the security hole, right? So it's just impractical now, in my opinion, to think that to roll out a corporate VPN thinking that people are going to boot up their computer in the morning and stay connected to that 100% of the time. People don't do that. And because they don't do that, it's become this threat vector.
Well, Fran, one thing I would also add to that is that you have situations now, if you look at our company, where not only do you have the threat on the mobile side, but we don't really maintain many in our startup, or any assets on a corporate network. We're effectively all on the internet. We use hosted services. Of course, we take our security very, very seriously, but it's a different type of vector. So now you have a situation where if you combine these things, right, you've got kind of a very different network topology where, let's say, classical VPN solutions wouldn't really even make sense for a company like ours. And then you have the proliferation of mobile devices. So now you've got two vectors that are just like going off, into really different dimensions in terms of the kinds of technologies that have been available. I know that your company at Rubica has a pretty unique approach to dealing with those kinds of problems, but it's definitely something we face with an organization.
Yeah, absolutely. And, we'll talk about that a little bit more, I know, when we talk about accounts and cloud services, but you're absolutely right. Like, I think the days of creating this, this castle-walled corporate network are just, where everything's in the cloud now, everything's available from everywhere. And the biggest thing that we're losing with that is this intrusion detection prevention, this network layer monitoring and filtering that is really beneficial from a security standpoint. And so, that's what we need to be able to build back in, that kind of protective layer, but in this kind of new modern working world, not forcing people back into the old model. And so, although some gains can be made in using appropriate configurations on your home routers, disabling UPnP, changing default credentials, using VLANs to segment your kid's Minecraft computer from your work computer. The real thing that we're missing, though, on these home networks is that advanced network layer protection.
Yeah, that makes sense. We're having a pretty deep discussion here about, a number of trends that are really, really changing things. I prepared here one slide, which is, again, it's a security criteria, also known as the Common Criteria 6.6 in this particular SOC, which is a very, very common framework. And how do people think about, the requirements and what are they going to do to address it? And again, the requirements are things that we've really been talking about, which is what are the threats that are happening from outside your boundaries. And it comes down to a couple of key things. It comes down to making sure that you have protection systems in place and that you're doing some form of restricting access, which effectively is happening at the network level before you even get to the account level or any of these kind of logical levels. And there's, again, a rich history of tools that have been deployed in more classic infrastructures. And I know, Fran, you're talking about, the classic VPN, if you want to call it that. It is one of the recommendations here. You'll see it on the right, is to go ahead and deploy, VPNs. But I think, the issue that we're discussing here that everybody kind of needs to think about is what really does the future of that technology look like for these different access patterns? Also firewalls. And I was on the phone this morning with the founder of a young security company that was talking about a customer that they had where they went, their dashboard, they maintain an operations center for their customers, and the dashboard went from all green to all red on one day. What happened? Somebody attached a computer to the network that wasn't firewalled, and so everything went from a really low risk of like under 1 all the way up to like 9.5 risk just in 2 seconds. And once one thing like that happens, then that's really where your security stance is really, really compromised. But I do think, again, the classics here, if I were to talk about two of them, are the firewall and the VPN. But I do recommend that as these technologies are really moving forward and changing, that people look for more resilient and more forward-looking approaches to how to really, deploy these technologies. For instance, how do you deploy a VPN? Again, like we said before, if you don't really maintain a network, what's the new equivalent of doing something like that? And a little bit of what we're going to talk about here in a second. But the other thing is, there's a general feeling with some of these technologies around protecting your network that maybe you're really not as empowered to do it as you were before, because so much of the infrastructure that's doing computation for you is outside your network. So you end up, having this kind of feeling of like a shrinking domain of controllable, infrastructure that you can actually apply these things to. But all's not lost, for sure, because there's a set of great technology. I know Rubica has some here as well, around being able to take, what is really a more modern topology for your compute infrastructure and really be able to kind of lock that down, get it secure, and get it compliant.
Yeah, I think it's a good point that's worth highlighting, that I think people need to ask themselves, what is the intent of this control, and like you said, everything is kind of turned upside down right now. The world is adapting to remote working and, cloud-based everything and mobile everything. We adjust some of these controls and ideas around the intent of these compliance frameworks. How do you make that match the new world?
Right.
So just to reiterate why we have these, kind of talk about these three zones. If you've got your devices, your network layer, your accounts. If only one of those is secure and the others aren't, you're in a bad place. So, for example, you may have pristine device security, super locked down, but if you're connecting through your insecure network layer that can, that's susceptible to a man-in-the-middle attack where someone can intercept everything you're doing, then what's the point, right? And similarly, you may have great account security, right? Great passwords, two-factor, etc. But if you have malware on your device that can take screenshots and see everything that you do, then it doesn't matter if you change your passwords every day and have excellent two-factor authentication. So just to reiterate why this is an ongoing process and why you do need all of these layers. There's not just one silver bullet. So for the last section on accounts, I think Craig has a lot to talk to here, but I'll just say the biggest kind of shift has been this, proliferation of cloud services. We're all using dozens of different cloud-based services and accounts, and often also new tools and new services in order to collaborate remotely, video conferencing. This platform, I've never used this platform that you're using today for this webinar. So it's every day, we're getting used to using new tools and without any on-site IT support, right? And so in terms of policing people's behavior, enforcing policy, enforcing good cyber hygiene, that's exponentially more difficult now with everyone at home.
Yeah, and I think this really is, Fran, the concern. I think you really hit it on the head, which is there's a real proliferation of cloud services. And so if you really look, I pulled out over here out of the SOC program Security Criteria 6.1, which really deals with logical access control. And if I were going to highlight what are the couple things that are most important there, the one that'll be pretty obvious is, password policy and things like that, which I'll come back to in a second. But the other one, which actually seems like a little bit of motherhood and apple pie or a bit of a checkbox, but actually you start to appreciate how important it is the one that talks about identifying and managing all of these assets. Identifying and managing the cloud services that you're using. We're not today talking about data integrity, but there's very similar requirements and controls on inventorying and classifying your corporate data. That idea of inventorying and managing change is actually, one of the most difficult things. I mean, I know, speaking again as the operator of a company, when we have a new employee join or an employee leave, there's a pretty long laundry list of things that we have to do specifically around access control. We have to onboard them, we have to offboard them. Then there's actually, it gets pretty meta. There's certain, at our company, we use LastPass, and LastPass lets you kind of virtually manage some shared accounts so that you don't have to distribute passports, pretty broadly. So you end up with this kind of, tiered pyramid of access control, where you're controlling the services, you're controlling services that control services. And when it comes down, so that's kind of the identify part. But when it comes down to actually picking the policy itself and the actual password policy, like 8-10 years ago, you would say, hey, again, 8 characters, upper, lower, special character, whatever, blacklist a certain set of things that are, in a dictionary, and you're done. But first of all, some of the standards bodies are really, really evolving what they think the right way to handle passwords are. We went from I've got to rotate my password every 90 days to now that's not actually a recommendation any longer. So those kinds of things, because, you find out that some of those practices that are meant to keep you more secure actually open up different threat vectors of password reuse or going to commonly guessed passwords and things like that. That's one aspect, is around how fast things are moving. But the second aspect around logical access control that we find difficult is just that even if and you're expected to create a policy around your passwords, you're not in control of all the systems that implement them. Today, if you're using a pretty good smattering of cloud services, you will find it difficult to constitute a password policy that each of your services can actually accommodate. So now you're in a game of exceptions because, there's 1,000+ technology vendors out there with cloud services. So those are some of the things, to think about with logical access control. It's just identifying and inventorying your assets, creating a policy, being able to implement it in a way that makes sense. I guess I'll say one more thing when we've been talking more about accessing services from kind of, the consumption side, of the client side. When you think about hardening your own infrastructure around keys and how those are dealt with, it's another area to look into because it's a fast changing area in key management. I'll illustrate it by way of example, right? Over the last 3 or 5 years, the way that you manage keys and where you put them inside your systems has evolved quite a lot. There's even a new set of products that are key vaults and key stores to make sure that you're not putting your keys like in text files on a server somewhere. But what's happened even beyond that is that some of the customers that your organizations will deal with or partners, they don't even want you to manage the keys at all. So now there's a new set of services that allow your partners or your customers to actually manage those keys. So I would look at that as the equivalent of, kind of the client side of password protection. That's kind of your server side of it, is passwords and keys, and really keep track of the technology there. Come back, create some policies, choose some tools, and ensure that you've got some controls in place to really, really satisfy that requirement. Yeah. Now, I think at this point in the presentation, Fran, I think we've gone through the threat vectors that you're looking, to lay out for folks, and I've been able to add some color on how we keep compliant with each of those threat vectors. I'm going to transition here for us to kind of the final part of the presentation. I'll apologize in advance to some people if some of this seems a little bit like a pitch. It's not our intention, but we do want to talk a little bit about how technology can help in these areas. And, we're going to highlight some of the capabilities in Hyperproof and in Rubica. If you don't want to be pitched product, this would be the time to sign off, but we hope you stay. So in terms of how technology makes it easier, I'm going to spend just a few slides highlighting what our approach is inside Hyperproof. Maybe it's helpful. This is both inside the company and in the tools we build to keep organizations like your own compliant. And I'll just highlight it with one phrase, which really kind of governs everything we do, which is continuous compliance. And in a nutshell, what we're really trying to do inside our company and with the product that we build is move the industry away from a place where you're just really getting your policies and your evidence and, frankly, your security in order to pass an audit, right? You're doing it 3 months before the audit. You get the audit done, you take a vacation, you don't worry about it for another 6 months, and then you start it again the next year. We call that occasional compliance, instead of continuous compliance, and we think it's kind of a bit of an insidious pattern inside companies today, but it's not driven by anybody's poor intentions. It's mostly driven by the fact that the tooling and technology so far hasn't really allowed you to do anything different than that. So I've done that also in previous lives and just prepared for audits. In our system, in Hyperproof in particular, we think it's really important to give you a pretty deep, set of analytics that tells you how your compliance journey is going. And again, I've said it before, it really is continuous compliance. It's a journey. You're going to want to look at it all the time. In our system, we really allow you to take a pretty deep look at the requirements that we've spoken about. Those are kind of highlighted over here. And also the control structures that we've talked about to see, like, are you healthy or not? And I won't really go much deeper than that. On the dashboard, if anybody's interested, they can for sure follow up with us, and we'd be happy to talk to them more about the product. There is a workflow piece of it too, where around collaborating with the people who have the evidence inside the organization, it's actually really, really crucial in order to be able to build confidence that you are both going to complete all the work you need to complete, but also that you're going to go ahead and pass that audit. And so we have some of those capabilities, as well in the product. And then the final piece that I think from a technology perspective is really important and we take seriously at Hyperproof is this whole idea of integrating. We've hit it a number of times in this presentation that, if you're a large organization, you might be surprised to find out that you have maybe 1,000 cloud services. The shocking number. You can look at Netscope and some others that actually publish these numbers. And that's because a lot of these services, they're not necessarily provisioned centrally, right? They're provisioned at the department level. So what we do about that is we make it much easier to bring data in from these different services. This is the data that you're going to need to show that your policies are being met, your data is being classified, everything's being handled the right way. And we do that inside our product with a rich set of evidence collection capabilities, both to automate getting the evidence in and then also create policy so that if the evidence isn't coming in at the right pace, the right people know about it back on that analytics dashboard that I was showing you before. So I think that's kind of a quick flyby of how to think about using some of the more modern technology. I know I illustrated some of these concepts using Hyperproof, but as much as I'd love you to use our product, the more important piece of it is just that you take compliance seriously and that you maintain continuous compliance, whatever tool or framework you want to use. And so with that, I'm going to turn it back to you, Fran, to talk a little bit about Rubica and how it takes on some of the challenges around VPNs, firewalls, and some of these and mobile devices specifically.
Yeah, at Rubica, one of the things that we've been a theme that we've been bringing up during this presentation is just kind of around what good is policy if no one's going to follow it or if it's not enforced, and what good is security if people are going to go around it or not allow it. If security is not usable and practical and built for these modern norms and realities, then it's going to be ineffective, right? And so Rubica's whole goal is to help make being secure easier for people. And we do that by building security for people. So much of advanced cybersecurity is built for the CISO or the IT team, and it's forced on users. It's made to restrict us, control us. And, there's good reason for that. But when you build security that way, there's a limit to how far it can extend and how effective it will be because of these practicalities around blended personal and work worlds, personal devices, personal privacy and freedom. And frankly, people are going to do what they're going to do. And so we actually come out of a world of serving initially, before we got into the business side of things, we were a security product for very high net worth individuals. And we had to build, if you can imagine having very wealthy and famous people as your clients, if they can't go to Facebook whenever they want to or get to whatever they want to do online, they're never going to use the product, right? And so security has to be, when you're building security for that demographic, it has to be an enabler. It can't be restrictive. And so that's our whole approach to security, is making it usable, building it for the practicalities that people need, and making it simple in the sense that with Rubica's product, you download our app on all of your endpoints. So it's Mac, Windows, iOS, and Android. And it literally takes like 2 minutes to set up. My litmus test for launching was my mother needed to be able to use this by herself without calling me for IT support. And that's literally how simple it is. There's no hardware, there's no integration, there's no compatibility issues. The point is it should be transparent, but it should protect your device no matter where you connect from, whether that's cell, Wi-Fi, home, office, doesn't matter. it should give you that network layer threat protection that has automatic blocking of the widest range of threats possible, but also the ability to detect new and emerging trends, threat trends as those adapt. So we do everything from, we have a number of different things in our security stack that enable us to both block known threats and also detect indicators of compromise or anomalous behavior that may indicate a threat and remediate that for you. So as a Rubica user, you can install Rubica at the device level, but get that network layer protection no matter where you are without needing to do any sort of thing to your home network. And I would say even one of the most important things and unique things about how we've built this is around protecting the user's browsing privacy. Because just to be very blunt, if people think that the company is seeing where they browse to on their personal time, they're never going to let you put this on those devices that are mixed use. And that is a huge black spot right now, or a blind spot for corporate IT teams. Is, you've got an executive that uses their phone, their personal phone, and they get work email and they can access documents from there or services. And there's absolutely no visibility into that device because of privacy. And so we've specifically built the capability to be able to deliver threat details about things that we've blocked and detected, things that need attention, or threats that need to be remediated, but we never share where the user was browsing to when they were infected with that. And that allows us to extend protection to these BYOD devices, to this like personal work blended world in a way that isn't really possible with other traditional enterprise tools.
Fran, I never heard personally a more succinct discussion of the tension between privacy and security when you just took me through what was going on your mobile device. I never really thought of it from that perspective, but usually in our world, in compliance, we think of them as just kind of two legs of the stool. We don't really think of them as like, as competitive with one another as what you just described.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's been a gap in security for a long time. And it's highlighted now given this remote working world that we're in. But that's, when we started the company a number of years ago, that was how we built from the beginning, because we saw that in the private sector that like, there's no way, there's no way Jeff Bezos is going to put CrowdStrike on his mobile phone. Right, it's just not going to happen. And so there's nothing on it, so, I know we wanted to leave some time for questions if anyone has any. Just kind of the high level takeaways are here on the screen, but I'll also say that I think Craig and I both agree that for security and compliance to be effective, it really does need to be balanced with and framed in the practicality of your business or your employees. It needs to be balanced with usability, productivity, privacy, and kind of embrace the realities of our remote working world. And if it's designed otherwise to try and force us back into the old world, it's going to fail. And so I guess I'll just leave you with that and turn it over back to Craig or JC if there's any Q&A that we want to address.
JC, what do you say?
So we have a question, but I would like a clarification. The question from Steven here. The question is, what is UPnP?
Oh, okay. Yes. Sorry. Throwing out acronyms without explaining them. UPnP is universal plug and play. It's a setting on many routers that should be disabled if possible. It allows you to remotely access the router or the network, and it could be particularly for home users that usually is not a requirement, and usually it's recommended you disable that to avoid any you having that as a threat vector.
Got it. Let's see. We don't have any other questions so far, but there could be a lag in just the latency of the system.
Sure.
Craig, do you have any kind of last comments you want to leave folks with?
I think, the last section around, just taking a look, treating the whole system of security and compliance as kind of a living, breathing, continuous, evolution, and really putting yourself in a place where you can deal with forces on the system and challenges in a way that's very agile. And I think the old way of doing things was very much around, hey, we get secure once. I mean, 10 plus years ago, you would just have a white hat hackers come in. They would issue a report, and if they said you were secure, you were secure. That really is what used to happen. And we've seen the security industry come so far in terms of making sure that we're all trained and making sure that we have a wide range of tools to protect us. And I think all of that over the last 10 years has been in pursuit of being continuously secure and continuously safe. And I think that's going to continue in the security space. My view in the compliance space, which is really the other half of the coin, the other side of the coin, is that we've lagged a little bit. So we're probably 10 years behind security in our ability to actually deliver that type of continuous experience and make sure that people are treating the core protection of their corporate assets, but also their employees, right? And all their stakeholders treat it the way it needs to be treated, which is there's constant threats and constant, attacks and constant bad actors. And so these systems have to be dealt with in a living, breathing way. It's not easy, but that's really where things are going. And that would be my last words, is to really structure everything from your process to your technology to the tooling you use in order to be able to be that responsive. Otherwise, you're going to be on your heels when something happens. And, there's some great stats around, especially for small companies. 60% of them who suffer a breach never come back from it. So this stuff is really, really important, more important than ever before. And, just think about it that way and think about evolving your approach. And I think there's a lot of great technology out there that can help that happen.
We have another question come in actually from Stephen. Would implementing either Hyperproof or Rubica save me insurance costs?
Well, let's see. I'll try to tackle that. Okay. Why don't you start? And then
No, go ahead, Greg.
Well, I was just going to say that, in order, so the really specific answer is not exactly, because when you get your cyber insurance, they don't necessarily say, hey, can you please present your security credential, for instance, your compliance certificate. When you go through SOC, you end up getting a compliance certificate. I wasn't necessarily asked to present that when I got the insurance in particular. What they tend to ask more about is the industry you're in, what's the nature of the work of that your employees are doing, et cetera, et cetera. So while I'd love to say that, you can take your Hyperproof, certificate of health and give it to your insurance company, I think at this stage of the game, they're not there yet, although we're talking to a number of insurance companies who are looking at that level of understanding, kind of the topology of their customers. The best I can say right now is that if you get out ahead of it, you won't suffer any really horrendous problems. Like I'll give you an example. When Equifax suffered its outage, they lost their compliance credentials and they couldn't get them back for 2 to 3 years. And I don't have the exact numbers off the top of my head, but I know some folks who are intimately involved, and their business didn't recover for years out of that. So I think thinking about it a little bit more prophylactically right now, but realizing it'll probably be an entrance criteria for some of the things you want to do as a company in the future is probably the right way to think about it, Fran.
Yeah, on the Rubica side, we've actually worked with insurers for since the beginning of the company, and there's kind of 2 things I have to say on that. Number one, having proactive advanced security like Rubica can give you access to better insurance policies. So there's some insurance policies, like with Pure Insurance, as one example, where in order to get $1 million of coverage, you have to have something like Rubica. And so it opens up access to better policies that have better coverage, because my related point is that a lot of cybersecurity insurance, it has tons of loopholes and exceptions. And there was gosh, I can't remember if it was the Target breach or one of the other big breaches, where the amount of money that they ended up paying out, basically their insurance covered barely anything. And I think that's one thing that maybe people don't quite understand is the nuances of the policies, where you can be, if you're not taking reasonable steps to secure yourself, which is a lot about what the compliance and controls like Rubica that we're talking about today. There's a lot of exclusions in corporate and private insurance policies that won't give you the coverage that you think that you have, even if they think that you haven't done enough to mitigate that downside. So I do think, I agree that I think the insurance industry will be, is catching up a little bit more. They're pretty slow to change, but one of the frustrating things that I've seen on insurance forums is they still ask, like, do you use Wi-Fi? Like, that's an actual question on the insurance audits. Like, I think that they're trying to gain a better understanding of how to truly assess cyber risk, and that's so the way that those I think that you'll find in the near future that in order to get certain coverage or to get better prices, you will need to have you will need to show that you have more in place to get those, but they are a little bit rudimentary still.
It's great comments. And one thing I'll add is that certainly the pricing on cyber insurance has been going up. I mean, you can say that about the pricing of everything, but it's been big enough increases that it's going to force some of what you're talking about, Fran, in terms of these companies getting a little bit more surgical about who they're covering and how.
Yep.
Yep, we have another question from Nancy, which is really around the user model for what is a user model for Rubica? Like how could a company think about getting it for how many users?
Yeah, it's completely flexible. So you can have as many users as you want on your plan, where our service is a subscription service. So it's a per user per month price. And that covers all of the devices for that user. So we have people who buy it for just themselves or their family, and others who buy it for their entire team, or even contractors, like key contractors on their teams, boards of directors, key advisors. So literally it's completely flexible on a per user basis, how many people you want to add to your team.
Great, thank you. Those are all the questions I'm seeing so far. So I think at this time, I'd like to just say thank you, Francis and Craig, for just sharing all this information with the audience today. We really appreciate it. And thank you, everyone, for taking the time to join. And we will be sending you the recording as well.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone. Yes, thanks, Fran.
Bye. Take care.
Bye-bye. Bye.